So hi everyone, my name is Jordan Pierce. I'm a master's student studying oceanography under Jen Dykstra with an emphasis in computer vision applied to coral reef habitats. Today I was going to give a summary of my thesis, which is titled Automating the Boring Stuff, a Deep Learning and Computer Vision Workflow for Coral Reef Habitat Mapping. And as many of you are probably familiar with this workflow, as benthic ecologists, you come up with questions, you form hypotheses, you go out to the environment and you collect data, you annotate this data, you analyze it. If the results are promising, then maybe a publication and hopefully a policy. I actually am most interested in this part in particular. I'm interested in annotating, coming up with a workflow that can be used to annotate the data automatically. And specifically for my thesis, I'm looking at trying to automate the annotation of benthic habitat survey images. And as you may be familiar, these images are collected, they're brought back to the lab, and they're put into some sort of annotation software like coral point count, where for each image, points are randomly projected onto it, and it's the user responsibility to manually label each individual point. And from these points, and using the power of statistical analysis, coverage statistics can be estimated and be used to understand how the habitat is changing across time. Now, if you imagine a researcher collects maybe about 100 images per year and annotates each image with about 200 points, you're looking at about 33 hours of work needed to be done to annotate the entire data set. But because of other responsibilities, it's likely to take much longer. So my thesis looks at trying to automate this entire process. And believe it or not, there's actually been some research in this already. So since 2012, deep learning has become really popular, and computer vision researchers have been attempting to create algorithms that can automatically provide labels for benthic habitat imagery. Typically, they create these algorithms and they compare them against each other using what's called the Maria labeled coral dataset, or the MLC dataset, which serves as a sort of benchmark that has 3 different experiments that you can see in the table below. And in fact, there's actually an entire website, if you're not familiar, it's called CoralNet, where anybody can freely upload their images, and a machine learning algorithm will attempt to provide your images with labels. Now, the issue with all of these existing methods is that they only provide what are called sparse annotations through what's called patch-based image classification, which you can see on the left-hand side, where patches are randomly extracted and just the centermost pixel is provided with a class label. Now, this actually works surprisingly well, but the issue is if you're working with a high-resolution image, maybe like 12 megapixels, which is pretty standard, and you're only annotating 200 points, you're only accessing 0.0016% of all of the information in the image. And if you try to do this for every single pixel in the image, you're looking at 12 million classifications per image, and that's just not tractable. So instead of trying to build upon what is called patch-based image classification, I look at performing semantic segmentation, which provides dense annotations, which is a class label for every single pixel, but in a way that's more computationally efficient. And I found that I can actually do this with existing point annotations for a data set, and then using what's called an over-segmentation algorithm. The one that I use is called SLIC, which stands for Simple Linear Iterative Clustering. And if you're familiar with k-means clustering, this algorithm is basically the same thing, except that it uses the pixels within an image. And what happens is when this algorithm is ran, the image is segmented into a bunch of what are called superpixels, which are just a conglomeration of individual pixels that have similar color values and distance. And the way that if you segment the image into a certain number of superpixels, it affects the size of the superpixel because the image is a finite amount of space. So if you were to increase the number of superpixels, each one becomes rather small, like you can see up here. Or if you decrease the number of superpixels, each one gets larger. And this is actually important because I found that I can use this algorithm with existing point annotations. Basically, how it works is you segment the image multiple times, and within each superpixel, if there's a point label, you propagate that class label to each individual pixel. And then what you can do is you find the most common class label for each individual pixel across all of the images, so across the 3rd dimension. And by doing this, you can actually provide dense annotations for each individual class. So here's an example of using sand, CCA, and hard coral. Now you can take each of these individual segmentation maps and just combine them to create a segmentation map for the original image. And what you're seeing on the left is the final result. So these are the dense annotations that we were trying to achieve in the first place. So you can use these for calculating coverage statistics, or because you have this for each individual image, you can actually use this as training data to then go on and train another deep learning algorithm. And the reason why you would want to do this is because it's more, it's computationally efficient, and also the results are much better, as you'll see. So the workflow essentially starts with an image and the point annotations. You provide it to the SLIC algorithm, and then you use that to train a deep learning algorithm. And then once it's fully trained, you can go back and provide it with images that it's never seen before, nor are there annotations for it, and it will be able to provide dense annotations for you both quickly and automatically. And as you can see, point annotations are a necessity. So what happens if you want to do this, but you don't have any? So this past summer, I was really lucky enough to go to the Florida Keys and collect imagery data of coral patch reefs to create photogrammetric models. And with all of this imagery data, I wanted to find a way to combine it with my workflow. But the issue was I didn't have any point annotations, and I didn't want to make them. So one of my advisors, Dr. Yuri Rajanov, came up with the idea of why not create a patch extraction tool that can be used to extract patches from each image to collect, to create a training data set for an image classifier that can then perform point annotations for us automatically. So the idea is you start out with this extraction tool, you extract highly representative samples of the classes that you're interested in along with the label, and you train an image classifier. Once it's fully trained, you go back to every single image, you randomly extract patches, and you have it make predictions on those patches. If the confidence score associated with those patches is high, then you can assume that maybe it's right, and you provide a point annotation in that spot. Otherwise, if it's below confidence threshold, you assume that maybe it's unsure and you leave it blank. But now that you have point annotations for each image, you go back to the original workflow, you provide it to SLIC, you train a deep learning algorithm on those segmentation maps, and once again, you can provide images that it's never seen before, and it can provide you with dense annotations as output. Now, to actually quantify how good these dense annotations are, I went back to my data set and I randomly sampled 30 different images and created ground truth segmentation maps by hand, as you can see in the top right-hand corner. And I compared the SLIC algorithm masks and the deep learning masks against the ground truth. I used 5 different metrics: pixel accuracy, precision, recall, intersection of union, and dice coefficient, the last 2 being specific for semantic segmentation. And what I did is I found the average score for each method for each metric. So you can see across the board, red represents the SLIC algorithm average scores for each metric, and blue represents the deep learning. And you can see that the deep learning model did significantly better than the SLIC algorithm, even though the deep learning model actually learned from the results from the SLIC algorithm. So it's pretty interesting. Now, originally, these images were for creating a photogrammetric model like you can see. And now that I have a deep learning model that is trained on these images, I wanted to find a way to combine the 2 methods. And it turns out it's not that difficult. So what I ended up doing is for every single image that was used to reconstruct the model, I then provided it to the deep learning model, and it gave me segmentation maps, corresponding segmentation maps as output. I simply took all of those segmentation maps and swapped them with the original images and recreated a new texture with them instead, with this being the output. So what you're seeing is the same exact model as before, but the texture overlay represents class categories instead of pixel values. And here's a sort of side-by-side comparison between the 2. Qualitatively, between the 3D models and the 2D texture maps, you can see that they're pretty good, but then you can also see that quantitatively, using the same metrics as before, it does quite nice. So this is very promising as a new method that can be used in the future. So in conclusion with my thesis, there's 3 sort of noteworthy things that I like to point out, is that if you have point annotations laying around for a data set like coral point count annotations, you can use them with this SLIC algorithm to create dense annotations automatically. And if you're interested in creating a deep learning model and you don't have any points, we've displayed that you can use some sort of patch extraction tool and an image classifier to create point annotations for you. And even though these dense annotations created by the SLIC algorithm, they're not perfect, we've shown that you can actually use them to train a deep learning model whose output actually surpasses what it learned from. Also, in the very beginning, the whole purpose of this was to speed up how much time it takes to annotate data. It takes about 6 seconds per annotation manually. With an image classifier, you can do about 200 annotations per second. And then with this deep learning semantic segmentation algorithm, you're looking at about 8.2 million annotations per second. So there's a speed up there. And the very last thing is that Sure, you can use this deep learning model to calculate 2D coverage statistics from images, but you can also use it with other things like structure from motion photogrammetry, which is a technique that a lot of ecologists use to quantify the structural complexity. So you can actually use them together to provide what 3D community composition, which is something that's a little bit harder to obtain, but then also you can combine it as a way of measuring the functional group, measuring the structural complexity of each individual functional group that before you just could not do. So I'm really hoping that this method gets picked up and other people start using it within their own workflows. And with that, I would like to thank my funding and my resources, which come from NOAA, CCOM, UNH, and a big thanks to Dr. Mark Butler and his lab, and also Oscar Bejerbaum for helping collect the data set and create the data set that I used for my thesis. And also Dr. Thomas Bukowicz, Drew Stevens, and Dr. Yuri Rajanov for their contributions. And with that, I would love to take any questions you may have.
That's super cool stuff, Jordan.
Thanks.
So you mentioned 3D complexity. How good is it at getting in under it? You know, so if you have like a little shelf of coral, can you look at what's up under it as well? I suspect that's a factor of the photogrammetry, but how good is the classification algorithm at figuring out, you know, the interstices and stuff?
Yeah, so when it comes to the structure from motion, to really be able to quantify that area, yeah, you do need to get down there with a camera. You can't really tell from this 3D model, but a lot of the crevices are captured because we were able to get into that spot. And as long as that spot shows up in an image, the deep learning model that is trained on those images should be able to classify it. So it should be able to handle it. Now, there's certain types of environments that are harder to create these 3D models for. So if you have a lot of branching environments, it's a little bit harder because branches will occlude each other, and therefore it's a little bit harder to find that same exact point, maybe because it's being blocked by another branch, in multiple images. So it kind of just depends on the environment, but it should be able to handle it.
Sure, I've got one. So how long would it take for someone who's absolutely not skilled in this at all to get up to speed?
Yeah.
Or just say one had a promising master's student that just came out of the McGill computer science biology department, and one wanted to get her up to speed on something like this. Well,
yeah, no, that's a really good question. There's a bit of a learning curve if you're not familiar with programming in general. There are a lot of people out there in the industry that are attempting to create software interfaces that are very easy to use for people who are a little bit skittish when it comes to programming command line interfaces. There are tools available and more coming out. So in the near future, something like this might not be as difficult as it was before. If you're already experienced with computer programming and you know languages like Python or even R, there's still a learning curve to understand machine learning and deep learning and how to set up experiments and training. But there are so many tutorials online that you can spend like an entire year just watching YouTube videos and reading blog posts and really teaching yourself. So I didn't know anything about deep learning, and I was able to do this in about a year. So there are definitely resources out there that help people.
but if I had a summer doing nothing, no field work, I couldn't probably pick this up in 3 months, huh?
Maybe not this exact project, but you could definitely perform some image classification or semantic segmentation on a data set that is already pre-annotated for you. You could probably do that in like a week, maybe less. Yeah. It's not as daunting as it seems, I promise.
You scared me a little bit after the third slide. Yeah, I'll believe you.
Okay.
Thanks.
I have sort of a follow-up question to that.
Yeah, of course.
So let's say you have a moderately well-trained coral net bot that's using a large photo data set from the Gulf of Maine.
Mm-hmm.
So I would love it to be better trained than it currently is. Right now we're at about 60% accuracy.
Okay.
Is this the kind of thing that I could jump into relatively easily to get our bot to behave a little better?
Yeah, definitely. So it depends on what kind of images you have, how many different things you're trying to train it on. There's a lot of different things that are involved in trying to make sure that your model is actually is good and able to generalize. So I'd have to know a little bit more information, but the biggest thing is just like the number of images and like how fine granularity you're trying to classify. So it'd be a lot harder to classify down to the species level as opposed to just classifying to the genus or like the family.
Okay.
Yeah, but if you're performing image classification, there's a lot of different techniques that you can use that will help make your image classifier better without having more data. And that's something that I could talk to you for days about. So we can maybe set up a correspondence and I can talk to you.
Fantastic.
About
I'll email you for sure. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no problem.